Now to create a new table, we can click on Tables here, right-click on that, and choose Create Table. Alternatively, again, with that database selected, we can also click on Create New Table up here, and this screen will open up. If you get an error that no schema was selected, you might want to double-click onto your schema first. And here we can now create a new table in that database. Now, a table is a bit more complex than the database itself, because now we have to define the columns that we want to have in there. Because remember, in relational database management systems, it's all about having clear schemas and structures in your database tables, so that it's very clear which fields every record that's stored in this table should have. So if it should have some text or some numbers. So you have to clearly define your schema for a table here. But it actually all starts with a name. And here I will now name this restaurants. Regarding the naming convention, it's generally up to you. You want to avoid white spaces here though. Instead, the convention is to name your databases and also your tables all lowercase. And then regarding the tables, it is quite common to choose the plural form here. And since we store a bunch of restaurant items in that table, we can choose restaurants as a table name. You could also just name it restaurant, whatever you want, and you will see different approaches out there in the wild. I'm a fan of using the plural form here and name it restaurants. If your table name would be a name that consists of multiple words, actually, you would separate them with an underscore between. Don't use white space here. So now that's my name. Again, we can choose how characters should be stored, and we can keep the defaults here. We want to keep that engine here, which is kind of the storage engine under the hood that will be used by the SQL Server for storing the data that will end up in the table on actual files. Because remember, a database still in the end stores data in files, but it handles that file access for you in a very efficient way. And there are different storage engines that can be utilized for that, but InnoDB is a great engine, and unless you really know what you're doing, you should stick to it. Now we don't need a comment, but instead now here, in this area, we can add our columns. We can define the schema, the structure of this table. We can add a first column, so a first field that has to be set by every record that's added to this table, by clicking in here, double-clicking in here, and then we can add a new column. And it is quite normal that you want to have some unique identifier for every record that will end up in that table. And very often that is called ID. So that's not a must-do, but it's very common that you have a column called ID in your database table. Now the next thing we have to choose after choosing this name is the data type. And actually here, if you click in there, you got a drop down with a lot of options. MySQL, or SQL in general, supports a broad variety of data types that can be stored in a database. There are some exotic ones which you will rarely use, and then there are a couple of very common ones. For example, int is used to store numbers without decimal places. Varchar would be used for storing text that's not too long, so short pieces of text like a name or an address. Decimal can be used for storing data with decimal places where you need a high amount of precision, for example, for storing prices or anything like that. Datetime stores a date and a time, as the name suggests. And then I'm not going to go through all these data types. Again, the official docs or a full course are the place to go for that. But a couple of other interesting types that I want to mention briefly are date, which is used to just store a date without a time portion. Then also float, to store a number with decimal places that does not need to be too precise. So where you don't need a high amount of precision for these decimal places. And then we, for example, also have Boolean in case you want to store true or false, so a yes or no answer in one of the fields of your database table. Now here I'll stick to int, because the ID which I want to assign to every record should be a number, 1, 2, 3, and so on, that is different for every record. Now this should also be the main way of identifying entries in the restaurants table. So each restaurant should have a unique ID. The names might be duplicate. There could be 2 restaurants with the same name in different locations, but each restaurant should have a unique ID. And this unique identification criteria, which you need for every database table needs at least one field, one column that holds unique values, which you can use to clearly identify your records. This kind of field is called a primary key. And that's why we have this checked box here in this PK column. This makes this a primary key. You can also see this down there in the bottom right. And that simply means that automatically MySQL will ensure that you can't store duplicate values in that ID field. So if you try to store an ID that already was stored before, you would get an error. If you already have a restaurant with the ID 4 and you try to store another restaurant with the ID 4, you would get an error. And you can now also check this AI box here to turn on auto incrementing, which means that whenever you add a new record to this restaurants table, you don't need to set the ID on your own, which would mean that you first of all have to look at all the other entries to find out which IDs are still available. But instead, whenever you store a new entry in the restaurants table, if AI is checked here, if auto increment is checked, then MySQL, this server, will automatically assign a new unique ID to this to be added entry. And it will simply take the ID assigned to the previous entry and increment it by 1. So add 1 to it. And that's why I'm using int as a data type, because I want to use a number without decimal places as an ID so that it can be incremented for every new record. I also have NN checked, which stands for not null, which simply means that this field must always be set. You are not allowed to add an entry into this restaurants table where you don't have an ID. Now we don't need to check the other options here. Unique sounds like you need to check it, and you can check it, but if something is set as a primary key, it's automatically unique. So you don't have to check unique if you already set it as a primary key. We also don't need the other options, and therefore we now have our first column. Now we can add a second column by simply clicking in that second row here when we define our schema. And then, well, it comes down to what else we want to store. And for example, we might want to store the name of a restaurant. So I'll give this column a name of name. And the data type here indeed should be some text, and varchar is the right solution here if it's not super long text. For a super long text, we would have the text type here, or even long text if it's a very long text. But here I don't want to have an overly long text, just a short piece of text, and therefore I'll use varchar. And between those parentheses, you can then define the maximum amount of characters that are allowed here. And I'll choose 255 here, which is a common value. So therefore, I'll set this. And I'll also check not null, because I don't want an empty value here. You have to provide some name. I don't check anything else because duplicate names are allowed. It's not my primary key. Instead, that's my ID. And it's also not auto incrementing or anything like that. Now we might want to store more data. Here, I'll just add one more field, and that will be the type of restaurant. And I'll also set this to be text. Also use varchar 255 here, and also make this not null. So that would be something like Italian or Indian or German. And with that, I have these 3 columns. This is not the final schema I want. Instead, we will soon plan this schema in more details. Here, we're just getting started with this MySQL Workbench tool and with the SQL language in general. So we will come back to this later and create more elaborate tables once we have our final schema in mind. But to get started, this doesn't look too bad. And therefore now, with that all defined, we can leave all the rest and click on Apply here. And again, we then see the SQL statement that will be executed. And just to make this very clear, you don't need to use this graphical user interface which we have used here. You don't need to do that, neither for creating a database nor for creating a table. Once you know SQL, once you know it really well, you can of course write those statements on your own and then just execute them, either through a tool like this or in other ways, like directly connecting to a database through the command line. But that's all a bit more advanced and simply not the main goal of this course. Therefore, this graphical user interface, MySQL Workbench, is of course perfect to get started with SQL and to get started with working with that database. So therefore here, we got another SQL statement that was generated for us. And here we see that the keywords are create table. Then we tell the server for which database we want to create a new table, and then the table name, separated by a dot, so it's database name dot table name. Again, we got those backticks here around our names, but if there are no special characters in those names, you can actually omit these backticks here. You don't need to have them here. So just to prove this, I'll remove them. And then between parentheses here, we have the different columns that we want to define. The names again are between those backticks, and again, they are not required here because there are no special characters in our names. If there would be, we would need these backticks. And then we have the configuration for every column after the column name. And then the different columns are separated by commas. And here we can see that for the ID, it should be an integer, not null, and auto increment. Name should be a varchar and not null, and type as well. And then after defining all these columns, we also make it clear that the primary key of that table will be the ID column. And we can also remove the backticks here. Last but not least, the engine that should be used for this table is defined. And if we now click Apply, that's executed. And if I click Finish, now if we expand tables here, we see our table. And if we expand that, we can also have a look at the columns that we defined here. And that's, by the way, just some graphical representation of our tables, which we can use here in MySQL Workbench to analyze our database and the tables we got in there. So now with that, we created our table in our database and we saw our first SQL statements. Now let's also dive into more SQL statements and add first pieces of data into this restaurants table before we then take what we learned thus far and apply it to the main goal of this section to build the real schema and the real tables for this restaurants reviews application.